In 2021, a number of studies found that the Amazon rainforest is today a net emitter of carbon and other greenhouse gases, particularly methane. Lung to tumour. Accounting for over half of the world's remaining rainforest and 20% of both liquid freshwater and oxygen production. The Amazon exerts more power over the Earth's carbon cycle than any other terrestrial ecosystem. It has already lost between 17 to 20% of its span to deforestation. The carbon and methane thrown into the atmosphere by these incursions, or the vast cattle ranches and cramped mines which follow in their wake, have thus unleashed a deeply dangerous feedback loop. Wildfires, a common result of deforestation, show the sheer scale of this problem. In 2005, tree loss provoked by a dry year released an additional amount of carbon equivalent to the annual emissions of Europe and Japan combined. Whilst the potentially exponential catalyst provided to atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration by this process is evident, its significance extends further still. Rainforests play a key role in the cycling of water, returning rain from soil, vegetation and fungi to the skies as steam, or in droplets plucked by clouds from the boughs of the tallest trees. Annual rainfall has already fallen across 69% of the forest, and a 2023 study suggests that South American monsoon patterns are now approaching a critical conjuncture, potentially lowering rainfall by as much as 30% in the coming years. This poses major problems for the Amazon's survival, for other ecosystems across the region, and for the human systems of production dependent upon their fruit. From these symptoms and others, it is clear that a tipping point has been passed. The ecosystem we have known as the Amazon, home to around 25% of terrestrial biodiversity, is now gone. Its aggregate function utterly changed. Where some estimates suggest that the loss of just 25% of the original forest will spell its doom, others go further, suggesting that this point has already passed. There is no simple way back, if indeed there is a way back at all. As the Marxist biologists Richard Lewontin and Richard Levins put it, environments are as much the product of organisms as organisms are of environments. At the edges, where savanna eats into thin soils and trees wither with disease. By the brooks which babble no more. In the wails of hunted and retreating things. Here it is clear that the organisms which have sewn together the Amazon with their communion, whether cooperation or competition, are being dispersed, desiccated, and destroyed. An invasive disease has filled the forest's sinews. mass extinctions are complex phenomena. In a technical sense, this term describes a period when real rates of species extinction exceed the background rate, that is, the normal rate of extinction. There is considerable disagreement on the number of such events, but scholars most frequently agree upon the Big Five, that is, periods which saw the extinction of around or over 75% of species globally. These are the Ordovician, the Devonian, the Permian, the Triassic-Jurassic, and the Cretaceous-Tertiary mass extinctions. Each of these periods represented an existential threat to life on Earth. The worst of them, the Permian, saw the extinction of up to 96% of all species. Their durations are hotly debated, but tend toward the low thousands in number of years. For example, studies suggest that the Cretaceous-Tertiary mass extinction developed over 32,000 years. The Permian mass extinction lasted around 20,000 years, and the Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction took just 5,000 years. From the perspective of life itself, this situates a mass extinction as an object of long duration, lasting many, many generations. In geological time, it is the blink of an eye. This poses a particular problem in identifying the causes of the Big Five, as the fossil record is often sparse and difficult to parse. A 2017 paper by David Bond and Stephen Grasby, titled On the Causes of Mass Extinctions, provides a viable answer. As events of this scale occur simultaneously on land and in the ocean, they must bridge these ecosystems by atmospheric change, for example. Bond and Grasby are keen to point to the temporal proximity of large-scale volcano eruptions to each of the Big Five mass extinctions in an explanatory capacity, but their analytical framework can account for much more. Whether an asteroid impacts nuclear winter or large-scale eruptions from the Deccan Traps, shoved into motion by it, led to the Cretaceous-Tertiary mass extinction, both clearly unite terrestrial and oceanic ecosystems. As Franz Broswimmer discusses in his 2002 book, Ecocide, the Permian mass extinction was possibly caused by tectonic plates shifting, causing changes in sea levels, dramatic volcanic eruptions, and climactic shifts. Again, these processes clearly provide a bridge between oceanic and terrestrial ecosystems. Each of the Big Five and their many hypothetical causes point to similar conclusions, and the correctness of Bond and Grasby's theoretical framing. This provides a compelling basis for understanding both mass extinctions and what follows them, with each of the Big Five representing a shift to fundamentally different environmental conditions and thus a dramatic upheaval in the evolution of life. With this understanding, the severity of our situation may be approached. We are living through the sixth mass extinction. Real extinction rates are today estimated at between 100 to 1,000, or 1,000 to 10,000 times higher than the background rate, and growing. The variation between these estimates is hotly debated, though its growth is less contentious. For example, a 2016 paper by Megan Lamkin and Arnold Miller argues higher estimates tend to exaggerate contemporary extinction rates owing to incomplete fossil records and mathematical extrapolation underestimating deep time background rates. In contrast, a 2022 literature review by Robert H. Cowie, Philippe Boucher, and Benoit Fontaine notes that lower estimates tend to rely on the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List, which underestimates current extinction rates due to both an attempt to preserve conservation funding and a focus on mammals. Whatever the case, What is at stake is not whether current rates of biodiversity loss fail to meet the technical criteria for a potential mass extinction event, but rather the current speed of this process. Whilst this is an important question, it is more practical to grasp the historical factors driving the present mass extinction. It is precisely here that scientific accounts tend to fall down, and in this respect, Cowie, Boucher and Fontaine's account is typical. Setting themselves against a reactionary apologism, which argues that the sixth mass extinction is natural and thus no action should be taken to halt it, their paper draws a strict division between prior, natural extinctions and the present human-driven one. More than this, they go on to argue that the present extinction event encompasses all human-caused extinctions, implicating the global megafaunal extinctions 45,000 to 25,000 years ago, the Neolithic revolutions and the invention of agriculture 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, and the 19th century industrial revolutions as stages of fundamentally the same process. Here, the fundamental driver of the sixth mass extinction is population growth. Humanity has expanded its environmental niche to the detriment of life on Earth. This approach is emblematic of what Marx described as the abstract materialism of natural science, a materialism that excludes history and its process. The present mass extinction is not the result of human life in the abstract. It is the product of a particular historical epoch of production: capitalism.
Awe ipa urihi hapauter urihi totihi kuoma maki heiter ipa urihi jai waniare ma urihi warasip mare mahe urihi tare mare mahe mau shami mare mahe.
Gold miners dig pits in the earth, releasing the rainforest's ancient gases. They use mercury in processing the metal. It seeps into the air, the dirt, and the water.
They bathe and drink the water from the river where the miners work. On his arm, you can clearly see his wounds. We'll put cream on it and let it sit for half an hour. The skin infection can be caused by water contaminated with mercury. Here, there's no access to other water. We're treating them today, but we'll have to repeat the treatment in a few months. Again and again. There's nothing more we can do.
$1.5 million people in the Amazon already suffer from mercury poisoning. The worst impacts are felt among the rainforest's indigenous peoples and rural poor. Among some indigenous groups, it threatens whole populations. For example, over 79% of Nahau people tested on the Nahau-Nanti Reserve in Peru had high levels of mercury poisoning in 2014. Alluvial gold mining on indigenous reserves has since increased enormously. With an average consumption of fish 6 times the global average, the peoples of the rainforest's dependence upon this staple is clear. Below the waters, the gold's noxious touch waits. A study in the Brazilian Amazon found that 81% of carnivorous fish had detectable mercury levels, implying broader contamination of the food chain. Studies indicate that fish consumption by birds and land animals contributes significantly to the poison's spread. Plants by the riverbanks take the poison into their root systems, dispersing it through the soil. Steam and rain cycle quicksilver through the whole ecosystem. This also threatens the Amazon's urban centres. These populations, like those in the rainforest proper, are reliant on fish, with double the global average consumption, and upon fresh water from the rivers. Peru, for example, takes around 1/6 of its national water supply from the region. Through these many watery veins, mercury has travelled vast distances. One study indicates that over 6,000 kilometres of water bodies in the Guianas are tainted by the chemical. In people, mercury poisoning leads to devastating neurological damage, kidney failure, heart failure, and many other convulsions. It also damages the nervous systems and reproductive systems of most animals. Whilst many plants only absorb small amounts of the chemical, it has been shown to reduce growth and damage capacity for reproduction significantly.
En este momento mucho temblor como síntoma de piquicardia. Por ejemplo, los nervios nunca están activos como es debido. Siempre hay alteraciones, ¿sí? Alteraciones virtuales. La mayoría a las 24 horas. Entonces, como es un mercurio, él va tocando toda la base. Que el momento que sí, que pierde de pronto, comienza a perder pérdida de cabello, según cómo se vaya implementando. Listo, que va perdiendo de pronto la visibilidad sensual,
The diffusion of mercury through the Amazon's many winding waterways illustrates something of the depth of the crises facing the rainforest. Their scope is equally staggering. Across its 5,500,000 square kilometres, which encompass Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, French Guiana, Guyana, Suriname, and Venezuela, the rainforest is also beset by logging, hunting, overfishing, industrial farming for cash crops and livestock, oil and gas extraction, and urbanisation. Mercury's silent tread is accompanied by rather more obvious forces. Agricultural runoff and sewage both join in its assault upon the waters and their populations. The mine's competitors declare themselves on the surf, rafts dredging for gold on the riverbed. The combination of these economic activities and their byproducts presents a vast number of distinct challenges for the ecosystems they confront. Worse still, the technical nature of the development at play lends itself to expansion. The roads, which now cover 41% of the rainforest, a necessity of large-scale economic activity and urbanisation, do not only slice through animal migration routes and quicken the pace at which the forest's bounty may reach the market. They also provide easy access to relatively undisturbed canopies. A 2014 study concluded that 94.9% of all deforestation takes place within 5.5 kilometres of a road or 1 kilometre of a navigable river. it is easy enough to conclude that these forces are those which stand behind the spoliation of the rainforest. Its exponential increase in pace and the changes in its aggregate function in terms of atmospheric greenhouse gas flows. We may even put this causality in simple statistics. Deforestation is the primary driver of habitat loss in the Amazon. A 2021 survey found that cattle ranching pastures occupied around 75% of deforested public lands. In the same year, these ranches accounted for 17% of Brazil's methane emissions. However, this alone does not tell us much. In ecological terms, the density of interaction between and among the forces assaulting the rainforests and those organisms assaulted allows for abstraction only in terms of broad dynamics. To make any sense of the changing Amazon and the struggle of its multitudes as they really are requires painstaking study of local conditions and long-term observation. Socially, the centrality of extractive industries in the destruction of the Amazon merely tells us that wood, cash crops, meat, oil, or gold production in the region are today driving the rainforest's destruction. It does not explain what motivates them.
A riqueza daqui, a gente sabe que ela não fica aqui. Aquela renda vai entrar no bolso do capitalista e do político. E o povo daqui vai ficar só com o estrago.
The overwhelming majority of the workers employed in gold mines across the Amazon are essentially slaves. This is forced upon them in many ways. A combination of debt traps workers charged for recruitment fees, lodgings and food at rates they cannot repay, and trafficking are the most common methods. As a common commodity on trafficking markets, child labour is rife.
Vocês pagam tudo aqui no ouro, né? Tipo um cigarro, uma água, tudo que for, é tudo no ouro, né? Vocês podem me dar uma relação de valores assim, tipo uma Coca-Cola, quanto custa?
Em torno de 1 grama.
Um cigarro.
Cigarro é 1 grama pacote. 2 gramas pacote.
O pacote que você diz, o
maço completo.
O maço completo.
10.
Men with guns patrol the mine's edges. They are tasked with stopping escapees. As well as serving as guards, these men also play a crucial role in disciplining the workforce. An account from a worker rescued from a gold mine explains that anyone at the mine he worked in with too much debt by the end of the month was executed. Conditions here are abominable. Accidents on the job are common, even those resulting in death, and no personal protective equipment is provided for the workforce. Miners are first in line for poisoning from both mercury and cyanide, also used in the processing of gold. Those who work the mines are also subject to appalling living quarters, with no protection from extreme heat or cold, no sanitation, and contaminated water. Though severe disease is common, medical care is all but unheard of. Aside from those who directly work the pits, gold mines in the Amazon traffic children and women to work at bars and brothels in the immediate area. children often make up half or more of those imprisoned in these brothels.
En las Pampas, ¿no?
Sí me han dicho, pero me da miedo.
Son mineros ahí, ¿no es cierto?
Mineros, pero también así conforme ganan, también gastan, pues.
Y ahí se está lleno de chibolas, ¿no?
Se van, dice, pero por un día, 2 días se demoran, pero porque saben que es peligroso. Les matan ahí por 500 soles nada más. Les llevan con engaños, pues, y ya no vuelven ya.
O sea, de otro sitio traían, se lo ponían, se necesita señoritas para que trabajen mozas, ¿no? Así. Seleccionaban a las chicas bonitas y se las traían para acá.
Menores de edad.
Sí, pero más que todo se lo llevaban a la Pampa, la mayoría se lo llevaban.
The workforce drawn to the mines out of economic desperation or trafficking largely consists of undocumented peoples, criminals fleeing arrest, and ex-prisoners. Aside from migrants, these undocumented workers largely consist of indigenous peoples and subsistence farmers dispossessed of their land. As deforestation results from all of the economic activities implicated in the Amazon's destruction, it serves as a rough indication of their progress. Prior to the 2000s, population growth stood as the dominant explanation for the loss of forest cover. This position was backed, primarily, by a simple statistical correlation. The registered population of the Amazon basin has risen from an estimate of around 100,000 in 1960 to just under 29 million in 2023. Essentially all deforestation has occurred within the same period. Though a shift in academic focus since the 2000s has shown the significance of factors other than population size for deforestation, this has not necessarily disrupted the causal link drawn. Rather, population size is treated as one of a number of determining factors in much of the literature, related to the growth of destructive economic infrastructure as a potential, though not exclusive, motivation. In contrast, a 2016 study on population growth and density in the Brazilian Amazon between 2000 and 2010 by Isabelle Trich and Francois Michel Letourneau illustrates that population and deforestation are often decoupled developments. The study highlights that whilst high population, high deforestation patterns do subsist, both high population, low deforestation and low population, high deforestation patterns are growing. Human deserts accounted for a third of deforested land and just 1.5% of the population in 2010, with deforestation increasing and population decreasing in these areas through the prior decade. The same period saw a marked increase in the concentration of the rural population, both in large villages and within the rainforest itself, and a 30% increase of the urban population. Though the urban population and large villages are associated with an increase in pollution, each of these settlement patterns has a low impact in terms of deforestation. This is particularly true of concentrated populations within the rural rainforest, largely consisting of indigenous peoples and subsistence farmers, with these regions showing a deforestation rate of around 0.18% of original forest cover. What emerges from this overview is a picture of the settlement pattern driving the deforestation of the Amazon. Rather than population growth, rural depopulation giving way to resource extraction, industrial agriculture, and population concentration appears as the primary motor of the process. Though Trich and Letourneau's analysis only concerns the Brazilian Amazon, The same process can be seen elsewhere, as shown by a 2019 study of the Ecuadorian Amazon and a 2005 study of the Amazon as a whole. The ubiquity of this pattern undermines the conclusions these studies draw from it, each arguing for a greater local focus in analysis. Whilst such analysis is undoubtedly useful, it is clear that this development pattern is united. What unites it is the crucial question. (2022). 200 tribes fill the Brazilian capital to demonstrate against efforts by the Bolsonaro government to legalize mining on indigenous land. Among them march representatives covered in gold and red to symbolize the violence which comes with the gold mines.
Illegal miners have been offering food to our underage girls in return for sex. They polluted our rivers with mercury and poisoned the fish we eat. Now our youngsters feel they depend on gold to survive, and some of our leaders have sided with the miners because they feel they can't depend on the government for protection.
As alluvial gold mines are illegal across most of the basin, they cut furthest into the rainforest's canopy to remain hidden, leaving a network of roads for other industries to follow. The experience of the Yanomami tribes, who live in a remote region along the border of Brazil and Venezuela, attests to the destruction this incursion brings. February 2021. Armed miners enter the village of Jelepe, searching for a villager. Tensions are already high. Since 2019, the miners have become emboldened. They have exchanged old hunting rifles for pistols and automatics. Gunfire breaks out, and the clash leaves a miner dead. Reprisals will follow for months, with many attacks and even massacres in Yanomami villages.
Lo que una parte por la rabia que tengo dentro del corazón es porque el Estado declara como reserva y nos da como, ¿cómo se puede decir? Como que nos da un pedacito de tierra con un papel que se dice convenio. No hubiésemos preocupado proteger, tal vez este río tenía que estar acabado, porque date cuenta desde que nos dimos cuenta cómo trabajaron ahí.
Open violence has become a staple of life on Yanomami territory since the discovery of gold in the mid-1970s. Gunpowder and lead, however, are not the only weapons wielded by the mines. Malaria, brought by miners in the 1980s, is now common. Between 2018 and 2022, an average of 3 Yanomami infants died every week of the disease. Combined with the mercury and cyanide pollution brought by the pits and a chronic lack of healthcare, the impact of disease in the destruction and dispossession of the tribes is clear. The pollution brought by the mines not only assaults the health of the Yanomami, it destroys their means of subsistence. As the fish have died off or become inedible, the tribes have been forced to go further afield or to seek food from the market or the miners. This dependency is complemented by the miners' offers of alcohol and other drugs, which have enslaved many seeking to ease their suffering and caused many conflicts among villagers. January 2023. The returning President Lula declares a national emergency, describing the assault on the Yanomami as a genocide.
Hey 2000 dois shirikaha na yamaku hey rashakuha yamakjai na kuye kuahe yamak sheupihi kuahe awe yanma yamat mapramang tep kuhikia mahki yamakirimi uri teri kami yamak yanmam yamak urihi parcial yamak urihi noamu.
E nós, índio, que está lá na aldeia, a gente está vendo, a gente fala para ele, olha, olha para o céu tá mudando, o sol também está mudando, e a chuva também está mudando. Então o homem da cidade tem que ouvir nós, tem que acreditar nós, para olhar no futuro adiante, e atrás o que está acontecendo.
The era of global warming has ended, the era of global boiling has arrived. The air is unbreathable, the heat is unbearable, and the level of fossil fuel profits and climate inaction is unacceptable.
Climate change forms the most obvious global bridge between ecosystems today, though its cause differs from any of the potential sources of the Big Five. Instead of bursting forth from the great rock spines and magma channels of volcanoes, or landing like a hammer from the stars, the engine of this process is found in land scoured by machines, in factories, and in fossil fuels. Atmospheric carbon concentration, the largest chemical contributor to this process, stood at over 423 parts per million, or ppm, in January 2024. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, it stood consistently at around 280 ppm. In consequence, global temperatures have already risen over 1.2 degrees Celsius since 1850. Not only does this rise not reflect the full weight of the greenhouse gases already emitted, as carbon takes a considerable period to realise its full warming impact, the process is accelerating. The 2023 annual report of the World Meteorological Organization predicts that there is a 66% chance that the planet will emit enough carbon for 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming between now and 2027. An estimated remaining carbon budget of only 250 billion tonnes before this milestone, and annual emissions at 54 billion tonnes. A figure still rising year after year. The scale of this process represents a transition to fundamentally new climatic conditions, which many have called the Anthropocene. Though initially coined in the 1920s by the Soviet geologist Alexei Pavlov, most modern accounts take the term's origin to be Paul J. Crutzen and Eugene F. Sturmer's short article, The Anthropocene, published in 2000. The fundamental argument in this piece, that humanity has emerged as a geological force with a central role in the future development of the climate and global ecology, is not new, its development dating at least as far back as 1867. What Crutzen and Sturmer add is twofold. Firstly, that this development is the result of a growth in human population and activity. This is the anthropo in Anthropocene, an argument in a word, as put by Jason W. Moore in a 2017 paper. Secondly, that the beginning of this Anthropocene should be dated during the Industrial Revolution. It is this framing that has gained widespread consensus across scientific literature, political formations, and media outputs. The political connotation is clear. Just as Cowie, Boucher, and Fontaine locate the force driving the sixth mass extinction as humanity per se, this formulation of the Anthropocene considers all humanity the motor behind the climate crisis. The beginning of an answer to such charges rests in an understanding of the development and application of industrial technology, and particularly prime movers reliant on fossil fuels, as the product of specifically capitalist relations of production. Setting aside his earlier contention that steam engines produced society with the industrial capitalist in The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx outlines such a critique in his discussion of machinery in Capital, particularly its first volume, and the notebooks written in preparation for this work, published together as the Grundrisse. That machinery is a social product can be seen even in a purely technical sense. Handicraftsmen were first grouped together in individual capitalist enterprises, where they had previously constructed the entirety of a given commodity. This new concentration allowed for a division of labour to bolster productivity, each labourer taking a single, isolated part of the labour process. This isolation of labour processes further allowed for the specialisation of tools and their recombination in the working machine. As Hans-Dieter Bahr points out in his essay The Class Structure of Machinery, such a view can only be considered controversial in relation to contemporary technology. Archaeological approaches frequently analyse prior societies' social formations on the basis of their tools. Whilst this illustrates that technical developments themselves cannot be abstracted from social relations, it is insufficient. Crucially for Marx, and Bahr with him, social relations of production are class relations, thus fundamentally antagonistic. The development and application of industrial machinery is not only made technically possible by capitalist relations of production, it is driven forward by the struggle between capitalists and workers. Marx attends to an enormous variety of technical developments and individual struggles throughout his analysis, drawing a progression from simple machine tools to fully fledged machine systems. He identifies two connected pillars of the capitalist push to implement these new productive forces. The straightforwardly economic impulse of this drive emerges as a response to the limitation of the working day, whether by natural causes, workers' struggle, or the legislation which emerges from it. Faced with stagnating profit margins, capitalists attempt to increase productivity and profits with machines. In consequence, production is fundamentally changed, where workers previously held direct control over the instruments of labour in a practical sense, themselves driving the labour process. The machine comes to dominate. The worker is deprived of their skills and tools, reduced to the appendage of a machine, and must work to its rhythm. This not only secures the productivity sought by the capitalists, but also lessens or removes the capacity of the workers to shut down production. The machine is the most powerful weapon for repressing strikes, exerting capitalist control through the very means of production. In Marx's view, this social analysis of technology applies not only to relations between humans, but also between humans and non-human nature. This situates technology as a product of class relations, an embodiment of previous struggles and power relations, and a real development which both organises labour's interaction with nature and determines its productive output. Marx's approach is at odds with dominant accounts of the adoption of steam power in Britain, and with it the origin of the industrial fossil fuel economy. In a 2011 paper co-authored with Will Steffen, Jacques Grünwald and John McNeill, Crutzen provides a summary of the core logic in such accounts. Whilst conceding that the transition to steam likely related to the beginnings of a new economic order that emphasised markets, Crutzen et al. Argue that the impetus for this process lay in overcoming an energy bottleneck. Other energy supplies were, they argue, insufficient in productivity and supply for the continued expansion of human numbers and activity. Fossil fuels shattered this bottleneck. This argument is identical to that put forward by the late English historian E.A. Wrigley, himself drawing from the classical economist David Ricardo. Where Crutzen et al. Are perhaps unclear on what drives this process, Wrigley is not, adopting the English cleric Thomas Malthus's argument that populations increase faster than resource supply as an explanation. A crisis of overpopulation thus drove the turn to steam. The combination of these arguments is known as the Ricardian Malthusian thesis. It hinges upon there having been a scarcity of other energy resources relative to steam at the time of its adoption, either in absolute terms or relative to the amount of energy required by industry. In his masterful 2016 history, Fossil Capital, the Swedish Marxist Andreas Malm shows this to be an utter fantasy. The transition to steam took place in a short span of time, largely in the 1830s. Prior to this period, animate power in the cottage or putting out industry, workers paid piece wages to weave at home, had served to hold back mechanisation in textiles, Britain's dominant industry and the leader in the turn to fossil fuels, due to its superabundance and cheapness. During the transition, another prime mover, water, stood as steam's largest competitor. It was both superabundant, with often less than 5% of the total potential of Britain's rivers utilised at the height of water power use, and at least as productive as steam. No energy bottleneck existed, and thus no crisis of overpopulation existed either. More than this, the adoption of steam did not even make raw economic sense. Whilst water wheels were often more expensive to install, they were both more durable and required negligible expenditure on fuel. Coal, in contrast, was prohibitively expensive. The Ricardian Malthusian thesis, the basis of modern conceptions of the Anthropocene, does not explain the adoption of steam. Marx's approach does. The turn to steam was driven by a crisis, the cotton crisis. Following a massive expansion in the production of cotton goods in the early 1820s, powered by easy credit, a rapid decline in foreign demand in the summer of 1825 led to a dramatic contraction and a collapse in both country and London banks. The rate of profit relative to investment in the cotton industry collapsed to around 5% amid a glut of unsold goods, having stood at around 50% through the late 1700s. It dragged the general rate of profit in Britain down with it. Competition between capitalists became vicious, and many concerns collapsed. In addition, the repeal of laws against workers' combinations in 1824 locked capital into direct struggles with workers over wage rates and hours, limiting the capacity to expand profitability by deepening exploitation with these well-worn weapons. Mechanization was deployed to bolster productivity, cut the number of workers employed, and crucially, to retain power in production as a weapon against strikes. This struggle would last for the duration of the crisis, culminating in the general strike of 1842. Steam's rapid advance begins in its mists, with a brief return of profitability and renewed investment between 1834 and 1836. Though this explains capital's turn away from animate power directly, workers acting as prime movers exerting considerable power over production, steam's victory over water power requires further explanation. As Marx briefly outlines and Malm shows definitively, this derives from the unique requirements of capital in time and in space. Water power is afflicted by drought, freezing, or differences in water levels, all of which can shut down production entirely. This undermines capital's need for ceaseless, or at least consistent and time-controlled production. Equally, water power requires that production be dispersed along riverbanks. Capital, in contrast, requires vast concentrations of workers to secure a ready supply of labour and to force down wages with the ever-present threat of unemployment. Though both of these concerns could have been addressed by large-scale water engineering projects, capitalist competition undermined this entirely. Individual concerns unwilling to offer capital to joint projects if they suspected their neighbours may benefit more from the works. Unlike water, steam could guarantee a capitalist individual control of both the location and the time available for production in their concerns. The turn to fossil fuels is unambiguously a product of capitalist relations of production. Fossil fuels secure capital's unique requirements in space and time by breaking production's reliance upon the irregular and dispersed forces of nature, allowing capitalist machinery to dominate the real process of production. Workers understood this from the start, viewing steam as a demon and deploying mass sabotage against engines in the strike of 1842, which nearly brought capital's satanic mills to a close. Only brutal force stopped this. From the summer of 2023 to the early months of 2024, all previous temperature records have been broken. The scale of temperature increases is so substantial, it suggests we may have passed a tipping point. Already, this has forced Antarctic sea ice into rapid decline during its winter season, an event not seen in millions of years. Brutal deoxygenation events and coral bleaching in the ocean, wildfires, drought and rapid flooding on the land followed. Climate uniting oceanic and terrestrial ecosystems in extinction's mutual ruin. The capitalist relations driving fossil fuel use seems to close the case as to the force behind this process. However, there remain important questions. Firstly, whilst this accounts for industrial machinery and its byproducts, for example plastic pollution, which both compounds the problem of warming and offers another potential global bridge between ecosystems, it does not, at first glance, explain national differences in emissions. A 2023 paper by Jason Hickel, Daniel W. O'Neill and Andrew L. Fanning illustrates the emissions of the US, Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan and Israel dwarf the emissions of Africa, the rest of the Americas and Asia, perhaps excluding China and Russia. Any account attempting to understand this process at a global scale must explain this. Secondly, though it is unavoidable that the climate crisis is now coming to bear as a primary driver of the sixth mass extinction, both the relations which have led to its formation and this extinction process itself predate it. Rapid changes in land use formed the dominant driver of this process until recent history. Each of these problems of analysis points in the same direction. To situate the sixth mass extinction fully as a product of capitalist relations of production requires an analysis of capital's relation to the land and its spread as an economic form across the globe. An unmarked plane lands on a strip of dirt, carved into Yanomami forest. Supplies in its cargo hold are unloaded, then replaced by gold. The metal is bound for the city of Boa Vista, on the banks of the Branco River. From there, it will travel through a network of smugglers across the globe. Depending on the nation, between 28% and 90% of gold mining in the Amazon is illegal. Despite this, it is easy to sell once procured. The only requirement for gold to enter the legal market in Brazil, for example, is a handwritten certificate specifying the ore's origins. One prosecutor described regulatory efforts as akin to trying to stop ice from melting. Gold thus plays a crucial role in laundering other criminal proceeds into more viable investments. By 2016, gold exports from Peru and Colombia, the largest producers of cocaine globally, eclipsed drug exports. Of course, gangs are not the only beneficiaries of this trade. A gold refinery. Owned by the Royal Canadian Mint, 1.4 million ounces of gold were processed here in 2021, leading global bullion sales and generating $179.4 million in profit, alongside silver sales. A 27% return on average investment. Though the Mint does not publish information on the source of its materials, Canada is the largest importer of Brazilian gold. The Amazon's gizzards are among the ores melted down in these machines. Refineries across the globe exploit gold from the Amazon in much the same manner as the Mint, purchasing unprocessed ore, then selling it at enormous profit as jewellery, bullion, or raw material for industry. The scale of this predatory, extractive relationship and its reliance on illegal mining can be illustrated by export statistics. For example, in 2020, the National Mining Association of Brazil calculated annual legal gold production at 62 tons. In the same year, the Foreign Trade Ministry registered 98 tons in gold exports. After Canada, the largest importers of Brazilian gold are Switzerland and Britain. This predation is not confined to unequal trade relations. 5 companies account for 70% of the legal gold market in Brazil. One of these is owned by Britain, and another by Canada. 3 of the 4 refineries operating in Brazil are owned by foreign companies. The dynamics driving gold production provide a glimpse of the fundamental relations driving the destruction of the Amazon. Production for the market, dominated by foreign capital. The historical development of industrial agriculture in the Brazilian rainforest provides another clear example. Following a US-backed coup against the Social Democratic Goulart government and the installation of a military dictatorship in 1964, attempts to draw Brazil's share of the region, which represents roughly 60% of the nation's landmass, into its economy became a focus of government policy. The initial phase of this push aimed to gather corporate investment and resettle families engaged in small-scale agriculture in the rainforest. Financial measures in support of this, including waiving corporate tax for 10 to 15 years, and exemptions on both export and import taxes, were launched in 1967, and an organised resettlement scheme began in 1972 with the construction of the Trans-Amazon Highway. Investment in infrastructure, particularly transport, followed. Though thousands of families relocated to take advantage of land redistribution, it became clear that resettlement based on small-scale agriculture had failed by the end of the 1970s. Many families found this approach unsustainable due to a number of factors, including a lack of experience in farming, lack of understanding of Amazonian soils, and crucially, lack of access to markets for produce. Large corporations, however, were successful, with masses of land converted to pasture for cattle ranching, the cheapest way to legally lay a claim, then sold on at an inflated price. This speculation raised the price of land in settled areas to a prohibitive degree, economically entrenching one form of the low population, high deforestation settlement trend identified by Trich and Letourneau as today driving Amazonian deforestation. This process continued through the 1980s, outliving the military dictatorship which birthed it following its collapse in 1985. Following a spike in soybean prices and the development of new technologies, soybean production and large-scale cash crops began to spread through the Brazilian Amazon. This not only added a new form of low population, high deforestation settlement pattern to complement that embodied by cattle ranching. It further raised land prices, leading many ranchers to sell up and seek cheaper land deeper in the rainforest, hastening the expansion of existing forces on the frontier. Combined with the further development of transport infrastructure, this process rapidly grew cities along export corridors. The fruit of this process is that the Brazilian economy is reliant on exports derived from the most damaging agricultural practices in the Amazon, with, for example, soybeans accounting for 14% of total exports in 2021. Despite this dependence, only 36% of profits from soybean exports were reaped by Brazilian companies in 2020, the majority going to the US, Europe, and China. The development of market relations in the Amazon and the settlement pattern driving the destruction of the rainforest are inextricable. They are one and the same motion. The direct force of already formed capitalist forces, primarily imperialist capital, wielding either the state or gangs in the examples given, has laid the basis for a self-expanding system of extraction and spoliation. On the agricultural frontier, subsistence farms and small holdings clear the way for cattle ranching and land speculation, which, in turn, clear the way for industrial cash crops. Gold mines strike out ahead of this, cutting new roads into the forest for settlers and industry to follow, terrorizing the populations already living in these areas into submission or flight, by bullet and by blight. This begins to illustrate the expansionist character of the process at play. However, we must go further to illustrate the dominance of market relations over the rainforest. The development of cities provides a useful example. Urban centres in the Brazilian Amazon were developed by government intervention through the 1970s and 80s as part of the military dictatorship's efforts to draw the region into the nation's economy. Rather than developing from an accumulation of rural capital or concentration around industry, they served as administrative centres through which capital, populations and goods could pass to fuel the swelling frontier. This dynamic shifted with the completion of infrastructure projects and the increasing dominance of monopoly agriculture through the 1990s. Private investment becoming the largest driver of urban growth. This reversed the flow of wealth, goods and capital flowing from the rainforest into the cities, then out of the Amazon through export corridors. As Dr. Peter Richards and Dr. Leah Vanway argue in a 2015 paper, the role of cities changed from administering space to extracting capital and value, with the development of market relations. And the urban regions upon which rural settlements depended became dependent upon the plunder of the rainforest for global export markets. The rainforest populations pushed from the land by force, speculation, and environmental destruction alongside those drawn to the region from elsewhere, have been concentrated in these export corridors in the hope of accessing jobs and services. They are often forced to sell their labour at low rates, with, for example, over 41% of the population of Manaus, the largest city in the Amazon, in acute poverty in 2022. This logic extends still further. As Trich and Letourneau identify, the rural population is increasingly concentrated in large villages to gain access to services, infrastructure, and jobs. This has resulted in a dwindling capacity for subsistence agriculture and hunting as these villages expand. Consequently, they too are rendered reliant upon the market. Subsistence crops substituted with imports. Even those indigenous populations attempting to continue their long-held practices of living with the rainforest are, to a certain extent, being captured by this web of exchange, as evidenced by the attraction of gold miners and their paltry wages, reliance upon towns for services, healthcare and commodities, or the work of NGOs in preparing these communities for integration into this economy. The market cuts across everything, standing behind every force at play in the Amazon's destruction, pulling every population into its orbit. And through this ensnaring web, it tenders its most fundamental product: waged labour. Marx defines capitalism as generalized commodity production, or perhaps more simply, as the dominance of exchange over production. By this he means that goods and services in a capitalist economy are produced not for their real function or use value, but for the price that they garner on the market, their exchange value. This makes capitalism historically unique. Whether feudal, antiquarian, or tributary, all prior modes of production were premised upon the production of use values. For example, feudal lords took rent from the peasants who worked their land in kind to fill their larders and furnish their armies. In contrast, the capitalist invests to produce goods for the market, with the aim of securing a profit. Underlining the ecological significance of this, in his 1999 book, Marx and Nature, Paul Burkett argues that this represents a shift to a quantitatively unlimited motivation for production, capital accumulation representing a limitless expansionist tendency, which contradicts all limiting factors imposed on human production by its natural environment, as it requires an equally limitless exploitation of natural resources. As such, capitalist production must be able to move beyond the limits imposed by any given ecosystem. This elasticity is not derived from any particular form capital adopts, money, for example, but from the source of profit in a capitalist economy, the commodity form of labour. Labour power. As Marx argues in the first volume of Capital, the value of any commodity is determined by the amount of human labour it takes to produce on average. The value of a worker's capacity to work is thus determined by what it takes to socially reproduce. Profit is derived from the fact that workers can create more value in a day than they consume in order to work. In a crude example, a worker can bake more bread in a day than they need to eat. As such, capitalist accumulation may occur wherever this curious, value-creating commodity can be found on the market. This is the source of capital's profits, and the elasticity which enables it to utilise resources from across the globe, transcending the limits imposed by local ecosystems. It is not, however, without requirements. For capitalists to take hold of this capacity, they require a world market in the commodity form of labour and the fruits of the land. This does not exist whilst the majority of workers remain tied to the land and markets limited only to excesses in production above what was required for use or luxury, as was so in all prior forms of production. The market in labour power and resources had to be created, as Marx puts it, by fire and blood. In the early 1500s, the majority of England's population lived on the land. By the end of the 1800s, over 80% lived in cities. Scotland and Wales suffered a similar fate. Capitalist industry, agriculture and markets had usurped feudal systems of farming and the common lands used for cattle rearing, foraging, hunting, or gathering firewood. The general processes behind this transformation are set out clearly in Ian Angus's 2023 book, The War Against the Commons, Christopher Hill's 1967 book, From Reformation to Industrial Revolution, and the final section of the first volume of Capital, so-called primitive accumulation. Feudal power in England was severely weakened by the end of the 1400s. Peasant resistance ending hereditary serfdom in all but name, forcing landlords to put in place fixed rents and installing the right to the commons in law. Faced with the need to lower rents to attract or retain tenants, some landlords opted to evict them, instead leasing larger parcels of their land at increased rents to commercial sheep farmers producing wool for a growing Flemish market. This marked the beginning of widespread enclosure and depopulation, with complaints of villages declining in population or disappearing appearing as early as 1483. As people were expelled, not only were the farms they worked lost to pasture, so too were the commons. This movement of capitalists was resisted by the feudal state and the church, who correctly viewed it as an incursion against their power. Between 1496 and 1597, 15 anti-enclosure laws were brought to bear by the Crown. This utterly failed. A commission on inquiry found 1,361 illegal enclosures had occurred between the first anti-enclosure legislation and 1517. The enclosure of the land and the siege of the commons even gained pace in this period. Driven by war expenditure, the influx of silver from the Americas via Spain, and the raising of rents behind enclosures themselves, the so-called price revolution, or Great Inflation, saw agricultural prices rise by 6 times between 1530 and 1640. As Angus argues, this left landlords with no way to retain their income but to raise rents and invest in production for the market, as well as drawing smaller gentry and large farmers into this process. It also drained the state coffers, prompting Henry VIII to disband over 900 monasteries and confiscate their land, around a third of all cultivated land in England and Wales. This was then sold to raise money for war against Scotland and France. As Hill notes, this opened the door for the gentry and larger farmers to transform themselves into agricultural capitalists proper. As such, by the beginning of the 1600s, capitalist ownership of the land was consolidated. This is reflected in legislation, with pro-enclosure acts beginning in 1608, and in the character of the state. The English Civil War, cementing the power of the victorious bourgeoisie over the crown. By the 1700s, the process of enclosure was able to reach into Scotland, culminating in the infamous Highland clearances. From tip to toe, Britain dispossessed its peasantry. Dispossession alone was not enough to force the peasantry from the field to the factory. For labour power to appear on the market en masse, their backs needed to be broken, and urbanisation needed to be made possible. This required a long war, involving direct confrontation and increasingly punitive laws. From the resistance given to enclosures, peasants tearing down walls and opening drained fields to the rivers, to the mobilisation of the radical levellers and early communist diggers through the English Civil War, peasants fought resolutely to retain their livelihoods. They were beaten off by the combined might of irregular forces and later the state. Brutal punishments, including execution for begging, imprisonment for hunting, and slave labour, tortured them into submission. Urban centres enabled by the utilisation of coal for heating and cooking, something Malm refers to as the Elizabethan leap in fossil capital, and large villages near to mines or agriculture, requiring seasonal labour, absorbed them. Enclosure created the largest single market in the world, and the first to offer commoditised labour in bulk. It provided the material basis for industrial capitalism, and with it a development pattern eerily similar to that seen in the Amazon. Peasant agriculture gave way to pasture for livestock, which in turn gave way to industrial agriculture, mining, urbanisation, large market villages, and finally, large-scale industry. The ecological consequences of this were devastating and unprecedented. As a 2022 report by the UK Environment Agency and a 2015 article by Ian Rappel argue, though wild habitats were largely lost by the time of the Roman occupation, the feudal commons provided a wide range of habitats and natural functions to support biodiversity. For example, open cattle grazing played the role of ecosystem engineering, kicking up food for birds and small mammals and redistributing nutrients across the soil to the benefit of flora and fungi. In contrast, the enclosure of land for monocrops, characteristic of industrial capitalist agriculture, is so profoundly detrimental to biodiversity, the land subject to it can be termed sacrificed land, as discussed at length by Angus Wright, Yvette Perfecto, and John H. Vandermeer in their 2009 book, Nature's Matrix. Since the destruction of these common lands at capital's hand, Britain has lost around 50% of its biodiversity, 70% of its ancient woodlands, 97% of its meadows and grasslands, and around 90% of its wetlands. So thorough and ruinous was capitalism's revolution in Britain that it could not be contained to the island. In order to consolidate its power over production, capital set out to devour the earth. The role played caused by colonial exploitation in the consolidation of industrial capitalism can be expressed as two distinct functions. On the one hand, the plunder of colonial territories laid a financial and organisational basis for industrialisation in Britain. On the other, the resources extracted provided Britain both means of life and raw materials for production beyond the limits of its national ecology. The example of British sugar plantations in the West Indies, discussed by Angus alongside the pillage of India, is illustrative of the first function. First established in the 1640s, these plantations grew to an immense engine of capital accumulation. Not only were sugar crops immensely profitable, the labour to grow them fueled a vast trade in African slaves, and to secure them, a huge market for British arms and textiles producers. By 1770, these three industries alone accounted for between 21 to 35% of Britain's gross fixed capital composition. There can be little doubt to the role this looting played for British capital's capacity to invest. However, as a 2008 paper by Jacob Becker argues, its impact was not exclusively financial. The experience gained in the organisation and division of labour on the plantation was instrumental in developing the labour organisation of the factory. The second function of colonialism for British capital, securing the resources required to sustain it, is equally clear. For example, wool and cotton, imported from Ireland, the colonies, and later the US, were crucial inputs for the British textile industry, the dominant pillar of early industrial capitalism. A similar relation can be seen across British industries. It is food production, however, which shows this colonial dependence to be pivotal. As a 2008 paper on the 19th century grain trade shows, Britain's reliance on imported wheat increased steadily with industrialisation. 5% of the population were reliant upon these imports between 1821 and 1831. Between 1891 and 1900, this had grown to 71.2%. Even where food was produced locally, the depopulation of the countryside undermined its basis. Instead of being returned to the soil, the nutrients fixed in crops were taken to the city, then flushed away to sea. As detailed in David R. Montgomery's 2007 book, Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations, the management of this problem required a vast industry in natural fertilizers, gathered from colonial exploitation and war. The combined effect of this wealth and resource extraction was the systematic underdevelopment of oppressed and exploited nations, explaining the historic disparity in emissions from industry identified by Hickel et al. Without this resource pool in its colonies, capitalism would have been stillborn. It is no exaggeration to say that colonialism represented a global holocaust. As Jason Hickel and Dylan Sullivan calculate in a 2023 paper, in the century from 1492, the population of Latin America fell from between 40 to 100 million to just 4 million. Central and Eastern Africa saw a population crash of around 15% between 1890 and 1920 alone. China lost 18.6% of its population, 81.9 million people, between 1852 and 1870. And Britain wiped out 165 million people in India between the 16th and 17th century. Direct violence, disease, and unrelenting economic exploitation combined to enact the most profound slaughter in human history. Though many advocates of Malthusian theories of the Anthropocene argue that this slaughter can be partially accredited to the resource requirements of growing populations, citing the central role of famine in this slaughter, this is straightforwardly absurd. As Hickel and Sullivan point out, such an approach cannot explain why, for example, the pre-Hispanic population of Mexico, up to 18 million people, could be sustained on the land, but the population of 1800, fallen to 5 million people, could only secure the most basic degree of subsistence. Rather than population pressures, capitalism's colonial enclosures and limitless ecological exploitation are the culprit. Franz Broswimmer provides a powerful illustration of the role of this process in relation to species extinction in his discussion of the slaughter of the American bison. When Europeans first arrived, between 40 to 75 million bison roamed North America. By 1891, only 541 remained. Hunting for industry, combined with the clearance of ecosystems for cash crops, livestock or resource extraction, provoked a global catastrophe. A 2023 paper by Gerardo Ceballos and Paul Ehrlich estimates 34,600 species and 74 genera have gone extinct since 1500. With species extinction for all vertebrates roughly doubling each century since this date. Though they conclude that this is the result of population growth, Ehrlich is a leading advocate for Malthusian theory. Their own statistics place this exponential growth of species extinction entirely within the capitalist epoch of production. Whilst correlation alone leaves room for doubt, the mechanics of this process do not. As production for profit gobbled the land, expelling its peoples and snuffing out its non-human populations in Europe, colonialism brought the world to capital's service. The ceaseless plunder of resources and wealth through colonial exploitation exported this capitalist ecocide across the globe, and in doing so also rendered oppressed nations and their populations now dispossessed of their land, reliant on production for the market. Operating under the self-expanding logic illustrated in the British clearances and the destruction of the Amazon, capital produces its own conditions, expanding through space as it accumulates greater and greater profits. This exponential expansion is the motive force behind the rapid changes in land use which form the origins and continue to shape the sixth mass extinction. Many prior modes of production were ecocidal, even inherently so. To fully counter the view put forward by Cowie, Boucher, and Fontaine, and similar accounts that the sixth mass extinction encompasses all human-caused extinctions, thus requires an approach accounting for both the global megafaunal extinction 45,000 to 25,000 years ago, and pre-capitalist ecocide following the Neolithic revolutions 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. Coinciding with the spread of the human species, the megafaunal extinction saw most large herbivores, like mammoths or ground sloths, and their predators, like saber-toothed cats, eliminated across the globe. As Broswimmer explains in Ecocide, or Isabella Tree and Charlie Burrell discuss in the Book of Wilding, the most plausible explanation for this extinction is overkill. Bluntly, these species were hunted to oblivion, beyond any real need would suggest. As Tree and Burrell emphasise, this had considerable impacts on broader ecological relations. Megafauna transferred nutrients across the globe, promoting biodiversity at an incredible scale. Their extinction, therefore, had a devastating impact upon the ecosystems which they fed. Whilst clearly a human-induced extinction, and even a global one, to treat this as the origin of the sixth mass extinction is absurd. Though it reached further into the web of life than those creatures directly hunted, it did not unite terrestrial and oceanic ecosystems into a singular process, barely gracing the latter. More importantly, it ended. Responding to a scarcity of big game and rising temperatures following the end of the last ice age, humans began to diversify their diets and adopt sedentary agriculture. Though these Neolithic revolutions were global, beginning independently in at least China, the Middle East, and the Americas, this process tied future societies to local ecologies far more than hunter-gatherers had been. This is expressed both in terms of simple subsistence and in social terms, the division of labour required by agriculture and the surpluses derived from it, leading to the formation of class societies, rulers dependent upon maintaining populations in place. Such direct dependence upon the land set definite limits on their ecological impact. As both Broswimmer and Montgomery illustrate, these modes of production collapsed with their ecological conditions. In Mesopotamia, agricultural production led the settled population to completely reshape the landscape, particularly through irrigation, leading to a dramatic biodiversity decline from changes in habitats and hunting. However, this also resulted in the salinization of the soil, the salt deposits accumulating as irrigation expanded, gradually undermining cultivation. Combined with increased taxes to fund the growing state, necessitating greater use of land, this ultimately led to civilizational collapse. The decline of Athens can partially be attributed to deforestation for cultivation, the city-state ravenous for wood for military use by the mid-5th century. Similar stories can be seen in the fall of Rome, the collapse of Mayan civilization, or in the fall of Chinese city-states. Simply, vulnerability to collapse in conditions of ecocide prevented any of these civilizations from forming the global bridge between ecosystems required to drive a mass extinction. To see within them the origin of the sixth mass extinction, therefore, is to substitute a pessimistic teleology for history, a linear process of destruction, replacing the real relations between humanity and non-human nature. If it can be said that technologies embody social relations of production, then it is but a step further to suggest that their byproducts also embody such relations. In this sense, the emissions driving the climate crisis can be taken to reflect a deeper social reality, where carbon, methane, and other greenhouse gases unavoidably represent a bridge between terrestrial and oceanic ecosystems, as we have argued. Their expulsion is rooted in something far more fundamental. Capital has today encircled the globe, leaving shattered peoples and sacrificed lands everywhere in its wake. In its ceaseless quest for profit, it has brought the inhabitants of every land and every wave under its heel, wringing gold from every vein and every tendon on the face of this fair earth. its capacity to move beyond the limits of any ecosystem, still pocketing coins on its poisonous course, have brought it to the limits of all ecosystems. This is to say that it, the relation of capital, is the global bridge between ecosystems driving the sixth mass extinction. That it, capital, is an extinction event, perhaps with even greater designs for the future of our home than meteor or volcano could muster. If we are to stand any chance of stopping it, we must be clear and precise upon this. For to undermine the terror that capital has unleashed on the earth is not impossible once the secret of its rule is understood. That secret? The expropriation of the worker and the maintenance of our dispossession.